Tonight, I want you to forget the headline for 10 seconds, because the story isn't just the US raided Venezuela. The story is that a single operation appears to have reached into the world's messiest petrostate and grabbed the lever that controls where oil money goes next. And when the lever moves, it doesn't just change a country. It changes who gets paid, who gets starved, who gets rescued, and who gets quietly erased. So in this video, I'm going to break down, step by step, what happened, what the US says it's doing with Venezuela's oil revenue, and the real oil money switch this flips. Then we'll name the winners, the losers, and the spillover effects that hit your wallet, even if you've never been to Caracas. No slogans, no tribal takes, just flows, incentives, and consequences. What the raid actually changed. Start with the date, because dates matter. On January 3rd, 2026, U.S. commandos carried out an early morning operation in Caracas that resulted in Nicolas Maduro and his wife being taken into U.S. custody. Soon after, Maduro and his wife appeared in U.S. federal court in New York, and that's when the story split into two battles happening at the same time. Battle 1 is the obvious one: politics, legitimacy, sovereignty, and whether the operation was lawful internationally. You've seen that fight everywhere, and it's not going away. Battle 2 is quieter: the money battle. Because the moment a government collapses, gets replaced, or gets managed, the world immediately asks, who controls the cash flow? In an oil state, cash flow isn't abstract. It's tankers, refineries, escrow accounts, blocked payments, sanctions licenses, and who can legally buy a barrel. That's the switch. If you control the switch, you can change the entire game without needing to occupy every street corner. You can reroute revenues, redirect shipments, and rewrite who is allowed to monetize the resource. The oil money switch in one sentence. Here's the simplest way to understand it. Oil production is the physical part. Oil revenue is the political part. A barrel can be pumped today, but the money from that barrel can be trapped, frozen, redirected, or attached in court for years. And in the last week, the U.S. has signaled it wants control over the revenue lane, not just the barrels. How? By pushing oil sales proceeds into U.S. Treasury accounts and by treating those funds as protected sovereign property held for diplomatic purposes, meaning private creditors can't just grab it. That sounds technical. But it's a giant neon sign that says, we are building a new pipeline for Venezuela's oil money, and we are putting the valve in Washington. Why this is happening now? You can't explain this without three forces colliding. Force 1, Venezuela's oil is special. Venezuela's oil is not because it's better, but because the U.S. has refineries designed for it. Heavy crude fits certain Gulf Coast configurations. So Venezuelan barrels aren't just barrels, they're feedstock that can plug into a specific industrial machine. Force 2, sanctions created a shadow market. When you sanction a petrostate, you don't make oil vanish. You make the money messy. You create middlemen, discounts, ship-to-ship transfers, paperwork games, and opaque payment routes. Force 3. The U.S. is treating the Western Hemisphere like a hard security perimeter again. And this is where the Venezuela operation connects to a larger message that U.S. officials have been making explicit. Keep rivals from gaining a strategic foothold near America's doorstep. If you believe that framework, then Venezuela isn't just a humanitarian crisis, it's a leverage point, and oil money is the lever. The executive order, why it matters more than the raid. Let's talk about the moment the switch becomes policy. On January 9th of 2026, the White House said President Trump signed an executive order declaring a national emergency to safeguard Venezuelan oil revenue held in U.S. Treasury accounts from attachment or judicial process. Translation: even if you are a creditor with a huge legal claim, you can't just seize the revenue sitting in U.S. custody. That matters because Venezuela has a long history of nationalizations and unpaid awards. Major companies and creditors have claims measured in billions. So the question is, if you suddenly create a new revenue stream in U.S. accounts, does that stream immediately get eaten by the past? The executive order is designed to stop that. It effectively says this money is being held for sovereign and diplomatic purposes. It is meant to support peace, prosperity, and stability. And private attachment could undermine U.S. policy. Whether you love or hate the move, understand what it means mechanically. Washington is trying to prevent a creditor stampede that would strip the new regime's cash before it can function. That's not ideology. That's operational reality. A state without cash flow becomes a failed state. A failed state becomes a security problem, and a security problem becomes a permanent crisis. The sanctions shift, desanctioning the oil. Now zoom in on the Treasury Department. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent told Reuters that additional U.S. sanctions could be lifted as soon as next week to facilitate oil sales, and that the Treasury is examining changes to facilitate the repatriation of oil sale proceeds back to Venezuela. That phrase is the switch, again, desanctioning the oil that's going to be sold. That implies a new licensing or carve-out regime. Certain barrels sold through certain channels with money routed into certain accounts for certain uses. And it also hints at something else. A pile of Venezuelan oil and or proceeds that have been stuck, including oil stored largely on ships, could be unlocked if the paperwork structure changes. This is how modern geopolitics works, not just with troops, with compliance. Who wins? The first-order winners. Okay, winners, but not good guys versus bad guys. Winners, as in, who ends up with more leverage, more revenue, or more optionality because the switch moved. Winner 1, the U.S. executive branch. Why? Because it has positioned itself as the gatekeeper of the cash lane. If oil revenue is held in U.S. Treasury accounts and protected by emergency order, then Washington can decide how much gets released, to whom, for what purpose, and on what timeline. Winner 2, U.S. refiners that can run Venezuelan crude. If a deal channels up to tens of millions of barrels toward U.S. refineries, it's a steady feedstock story, and the value is in the spread. Buy crude, sell products. Winner 3, big oil companies that can negotiate a clean slate. In public remarks, Trump told oil executives he wanted investment and talked about starting forward rather than relitigating the past. That creates a bargaining environment where new protections and legal reforms become the ticket price for capital returning. Even Exxon, which called Venezuela uninvestable, signaled it would evaluate a return if security guarantees and legal reforms happen. Chevron reportedly prepared for an immediate bump in production. That's not charity, that's opportunity under new rules. Winner 4, a Venezuelan interim leadership that can get access to real money. Because if the oil money is routed through protected accounts and not instantly seized by creditors, the interim government can actually pay for fuel imports, power generation, public salaries, security services, and basic stability. No money, no state. Money, maybe a state. Winner 5, anyone positioned in the legal middle layer. Think compliance firms, insurers, shipping, security contractors, auditors, logistics. When sanctions regimes shift, the people who translate allowed into done get paid. Who loses? The first-order losers. Now the losers, and again, this is incentive, not morality. Loser 1, Maduro's network, because the core advantage of a petro-patronage system is control of revenue distribution. If you remove the distributor, the network fractures. Some people will fight, some will flee, some will flip. Loser 2, black market middlemen. Sanctions created a discount economy. A new sanctioned but licensed pipeline collapses some of that. When money becomes more legible, the premium for secrecy shrinks. Loser 3, Cuba, potentially. Trump publicly warned Cuba that there would be no more oil or money from Venezuela and urged Havana to strike a deal with Washington. Reuters reported Venezuela sent roughly 27,000 barrels per day on average to Cuba between January and November of last year, covering about half its deficit. If that support is cut, Cuba's energy scarcity gets worse. Loser 4, China's Venezuela strategy. Reuters reported U.S. officials framed the raid as a message to China to stay away from the Americas, and said Beijing's days of leveraging Venezuelan debt for cheap oil were over. If oil that was previously heading to Chinese ports gets redirected, that's an energy and prestige hit. Loser 5, private creditors, at least in the short term. If the executive order blocks attachment, creditors may have to wait for negotiated settlement rather than courthouse seizure. That is a loss of speed and leverage. The second order affects what hits you. Now let's talk about you. Because viewers hear Venezuela and think it's far away, but oil doesn't care about your passport. Oil cares about marginal supply, shipping risk, and who can legally buy. Here are the channels this can hit. 1. Gasoline and diesel prices. If Venezuelan supply stabilizes into the U.S. refinery system, product markets can loosen. But if the security situation gets worse, insurance costs spike, shipping disrupts, and you get volatility. 2. Energy stocks. Any credible path to higher Venezuelan output is a narrative tailwind for service firms and majors, but only if legal protections and security actually arrive. If not, it becomes headline noise. 3. Sanctions precedent. This is underrated. If the U.S. demonstrates it can capture revenue pipelines by moving proceeds into U.S. accounts and shielding them from attachment, you can expect other countries to watch and learn. Some will fear it, some will imitate it. Either way, it changes how risk is priced. 4. Political risk premium. The Middle East isn't the only geopolitical oil story anymore. The Americas just got hotter, and political risk premium gets priced into everything from freight rates to sovereign spreads. The legal legitimacy fight is part of the market. Now I need to be honest about what makes this fragile. Even as the U.S. frames the action as law enforcement against indicted figures, international law experts interviewed by outlets like Al Jazeera argue that a country cannot enforce its domestic law on another state's territory without consent, and that using force violates the UN Charter's prohibition on the use of force against another state's territorial integrity. That matters because markets hate uncertainty. If the legitimacy dispute escalates, you get court challenges, sanctions whiplash, allies splitting, and companies freezing investment until rules stabilize. In other words, the switch can flip and then flip back. Security. Reality. Why the State Department warning matters. The money lane is only as strong as the street reality. After the raid, the U.S. State Department urged U.S. citizens to leave Venezuela amid reports of armed pro-regime colectivos setting up roadblocks and searching vehicles. That's not just a travel story. It's a signal that the country may be entering a dangerous transition phase. When security fragments, oil infrastructure becomes a bargaining chip. Pipelines, export terminals, and electricity grids become targets, and that's when more oil turns into less oil overnight. The creditor trap, why protecting revenue is a battlefield. If you've never watched a country change hands financially, this part is easy to miss. When a state is broke, everyone lines up at the same door, the oil revenue door. And the people in that line are not just governments, they're corporations, they're bond holders, they're arbitration winners, they're former partners with contracts that were ripped up years ago. Reuters noted that companies like ExxonMobil and ConocoPhillips have long-standing claims tied to past nationalizations, and that ConocoPhillips' CEO told Trump the company is owed around $12 billion. So picture the temptation. A new interim government forms. A new export pipeline is announced. New oil revenue begins to move. And immediately the old claimants say, great, we'll take it. If that happens, the interim government can't fund basic functions. And if the interim government can't fund basic functions, the transition collapses. Then you get a vacuum, and vacuums get filled. So the executive order is not just blocking courts. It's a kind of financial tourniquet. It tries to keep the patient from bleeding out the moment the heart starts pumping again. This is why oil money switch is the right phrase, because the question isn't only who sells the oil. It's who is allowed to touch the money after it's sold, what the White House is signaling with YIPA. Reuters reported the legal justification cited includes the International Emergency Economic Powers Act and the National Emergencies Act. That tells you the posture: emergency powers, centralized control, and fast-moving discretion. Think about the difference between these two worlds. World A, a normal government transition, money flows into normal bank channels, courts adjudicate claims, creditors fight it out, everything is slow and legalistic. World B, an emergency powers transition, money is routed into controlled accounts, attachment is blocked, distributions become political decisions, everything is fast, centralized, and strategic. The raid was the kinetic moment, IEPA is the plumbing moment. The tanker math, why 50 million barrels is a big signal. You'll hear numbers thrown around like they're trivia. They're not. Reuters reported an agreement with interim leaders would provide up to 50 million barrels of crude to the U.S., and another Reuters analysis said Trump referenced 30 million to 50 million barrels of oil under sanctions that would now be sent to the U.S. That's not a lifetime of supply, but it is a market signal with three effects. Effect 1, it tells refiners feedstock is coming. Effect 2, it tells shipping and insurance markets lanes are opening. Effect 3, it tells competitors the discount barrels are changing hands. And remember, a sanctioned barrel doesn't just trade at a discount, it trades with a shadow risk premium. If the U.S. rewrites the legality of those barrels, even partially, it changes the discount structure. Why heavy crude is a choke point, not a detail. Here's a simple metaphor. A refinery is not a blender. It's a machine tuned to certain input. If you built a machine for heavy crude and then your heavy crude supply gets disrupted, you can't magically swap in any barrel from anywhere and keep the same economics. So access to heavy crude is a strategic advantage for refineries configured for it. That's why the U.S. cares about Venezuelan barrels beyond politics. It's industrial fit, and industrial fit becomes political leverage. The 100 billion pitch, capital is the real occupation. Reuters reported Trump met with executives from Exxon, Conoco, Chevron, and others as part of a bid to encourage them to invest $100 billion in Venezuela's oil industry. Sit with that for a second. When leaders talk about running a country, people imagine tanks. But in a petrostate, control is often achieved by something else, capital access. If you can bring in capital, you can bring in rigs, parts, engineers, upgrades, maintenance, and training. You can raise output. You can restore exports. And once exports return, you can fund the state. So the real occupation, in the modern sense, is who controls the rebuild contracts? Who writes the hydrocarbon law? Who gets first access to the best fields? Who gets the security guarantees? That's why Exxon's CEO calling Venezuela uninvestable matters. It's a bargaining message. Change the rules, then we'll come. And if the rules do change, the entire Venezuelan oil sector becomes a massive, multi-year capital project. What security guarantees means in practice. When an oil executive says security guarantees, it can sound vague. It's not. It means, can we put people on the ground without them being kidnapped? Can we move equipment without it being hijacked? Can we secure terminals without them being sabotaged? Can we trust contracts won't be voided at gunpoint? If the answer is yes, investment flows. If the answer is no, nothing else matters. The IMF money, the other switch, nobody is talking about. In a Reuters interview, Treasury Secretary Bessent pointed to roughly $5 billion of Venezuela's frozen IMF special drawing rights assets that could be deployed to help rebuild the economy, and said he would meet with the IMF and World Bank about re-engagement. That matters because oil revenue is not the only cash source on the table. If oil proceeds are the monthly paycheck, then IMF reserve assets are the emergency savings account. And when a country is collapsing, emergency savings can buy time to restore power grids, time to stabilize food imports, time to pay civil servants, time to prevent a security collapse. But it also introduces another political question. Who decides how that IMF-linked liquidity is used? And under what legitimacy? That's another switch. The repatriation problem, where the money goes after it leaves the U.S. Here's where people make a mistake. They assume money sent back to Venezuela equals money helps Venezuelans. Not automatically. The real question is, what mechanism ensures the funds don't get captured again by corruption, patronage networks, or armed groups? That's why rooting, auditing, and conditionality become central, not as moral theater, as anti-capture technology. Expect to hear words like escrow, conditional release, verified procurement, audited disbursement, and humanitarian channels. Those are not buzzwords. Those are attempts to keep the money from being stolen on the way to its destination. The global message: this is also a warning to every other debt for oil deal. Reuters reported U.S. officials described the operation as a message to China and argued that Beijing's days of leveraging debt to get cheap Venezuelan oil were over. Whether that proves true or not, the attempt itself changes the map. Because across the world, there are variants of the same model: loans today, resources tomorrow, security partnerships, ports, radar systems, satellite stations, quiet influence built over years. If the U.S. demonstrates it can flip the cash flow in a single week, it raises a question every capital exporting country must ask: how protected are our strategic bets? That question doesn't stay in Caracas. It spreads. Why the oil money switch can move the dollar too. This part is subtle but powerful. Oil is priced globally. Energy trade is one of the biggest continuous flows in the world. When you reroute a major energy cash flow through U.S. accounts, you are not just moving barrels, you're moving settlement. Settlement is currency demand. If Venezuelan oil proceeds are processed in U.S. channels, even temporarily, it reinforces the role of U.S. financial infrastructure in commodity settlement. That can matter for dollar liquidity, sanctions power, and payment system leverage. Now, I'm not saying this single event changes the dollar overnight. I'm saying it's part of a larger pattern. Control the rails, and you control the trade. Two competing narratives, one volatile country. You're going to hear two stories about what happened. Story A says this was a necessary law enforcement action against an indicted leader. It was fast, surgical, and it opens the door to rebuilding. Story B says this was an illegal use of force and a kidnapping that violates the UN Charter. It delegitimizes the transition and could inflame conflict. Those two stories will coexist, and markets will price the friction between them. If you're trying to be right, you'll miss the point. If you're trying to understand outcomes, you'll watch which story gains institutional support, which allies endorse the interim government, which institutions engage, which sanctions are lifted, which companies commit real capital, which security forces remain loyal. That's the scoreboard. What could go wrong? The 5 failure modes. Let's name the failure modes plainly. Failure mode. 1. Security backlash, collectivos, splinter units, or loyalist factions target infrastructure and foreigners. Failure mode. 2. Court chaos. Even with executive orders, litigation explodes. Companies freeze until they see durable legal protection. Failure mode 3. Political fragmentation. Interim leadership fractures into factions and oil money becomes the prize in an internal fight. Failure mode 4. Sanctions whiplash. If licenses change weekly, nobody can plan. Traders demand bigger discounts. Insurers demand higher premiums. Failure mode. 5. Regional spillover. Neighbors absorb refugees, black market fuel routes expand, and the crisis becomes continental. If you can track these 5, you can understand the market without watching a single press conference. What who wins means if you aren't a trader. Let's bring it back to a normal life. If you're not trading oil futures, who wins sounds abstract. So here's the translation. If this stabilizes supply, energy prices can calm, which can ease inflation pressure over time. If it destabilizes the region, you get risk premium, which can keep energy costs elevated and keep central banks tighter. If sanctions carve-outs become the model, compliance becomes a larger part of business costs, and those costs flow into consumer prices. If the U.S. proves it can control revenue rails, other powers will build alternatives faster, and that changes long-term financial geopolitics.